Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the massive stakes and, frankly, the monumental strategic blunders behind Operation Sea Lion. That was Nazi Germany's master plan to invade Great Britain back in 1940. And yes, as you might notice, we're using a highly unique macaroni art theme today to visualize all these complex logistics. I know, it sounds a little out there, but trust me, it's going to make these massive historical concepts really stick. So, let's jump right in.
Okay, first things first, we have to establish the terrifying reality of the summer of 1940. France had just fallen in shockingly rapid fashion, and a cross-channel invasion was looming right over Britain. But here was the fundamental, undeniable truth of naval warfare at the time. Trying to pull off an amphibious landing across the English Channel without total air superiority, that was widely considered absolute military suicide. You literally just couldn't float a massive army across that stretch of water unless you completely owned the skies above it.
And the crazy thing is, Adolf Hitler actually knew this. On July 16, 1940, he issued Führer Directive No. 16. The directive explicitly stated that the English Air Force must be reduced so heavily that it literally couldn't offer any significant opposition to a German crossing. This specific order is what kicked off the massive bombing campaign we all know as the Battle of Britain. It wasn't just some random terror campaign, right? It was a strict, calculated tactical necessity just to clear the skies for their invasion fleet.
So, to understand exactly why this colossal undertaking completely fell apart, we're going to map this out into a few key areas. We'll look at the grand strategy problem, the three phases of the attack, the crucial doubting radar advantage, a pretty lethal tactical pivot, a massive flaw involving river barges, and finally, the overall strategic aftermath.
Section 1. The Grand Strategy Problem. Why was clearing the air so incredibly vital to the German High Command in the first place?
Well, it basically comes down to a massive imbalance in Germany's military branches. You had the Wehrmacht, the German army, which was practically unstoppable. I mean, they were supreme on land after just tearing through Europe. But then you look at the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, and they were vastly outmatched by Britain's legendary Royal Navy. Because of this huge mismatch on the water, the entire burden of protecting the invasion force got dumped right onto Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe. If they didn't achieve absolute air supremacy, the Royal Navy would have just shredded that invasion fleet to pieces.
Let's move into Section 2, the three phases of attack. This is where we break down exactly how the Luftwaffe tried to force the Royal Air Force into a fatal war of attrition.
Now, it's really important to remember that the Battle of Britain wasn't just one long, uniform fight. It was actually a shifting, multi-phase aerial assault. It kicked off in July 1940 with the Kanalkampf, or the Channel attacks. The whole point there was to bait the RAF Fighter Command into open-air combat and test out their coastal defenses. Then, around August 13th, it escalated into Adlerangriff. The target completely shifted to the actual infrastructure of the RAF. We're talking Fighter Command airfields, radar towers, and aircraft factories. Finally, on September 7th, there was the massive pivot to the Blitz. This shifted targets away from the airfields and directly onto London and civilian centers to try and force a political surrender.
Let's actually pause on that second phase for a second, Adlerangriff. This is when the RAF was pushed to the absolute brink. RAF 11 Group, which was commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, basically bore the brunt of this entire assault. They suffered massive airfield damage and hit a truly terrifying crisis when it came to pilot attrition. You know, planes can be rebuilt, but losing experienced pilots at that speed, it meant the RAF was literally bleeding out. The Luftwaffe strategy of attrition was actually working terrifyingly well.
So, how on earth did Britain survive that onslaught? Let's get into Section 3, the doubting radar advantage, and look at the technological ace Britain had up its sleeve.
The doubting system brilliantly illustrates how the British managed to neutralize those overwhelming numbers. Named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, it was basically this highly integrated early warning network. It linked the chain-home radar stations on the coast directly with ground observers and then funneled all of that real-time information to centralized command centers using standard telephone lines. It sounds basic now, but at the time, it was a totally revolutionary approach to air defense that completely removed the guesswork from the battlefield. To put that into perspective, the old method of air defense meant flying continuous combat air patrols. You basically had to keep planes in the sky at all times, just hoping to spot the enemy. That burns through a massive amount of fuel, wears down engines, and totally exhausts your pilots. But the doubting system? It totally changed the game. The RAF could actually leave their planes on the ground and only scramble fighters when incoming German raids were actively detected and tracked. By maximizing pilot efficiency and conserving those vital resources, Doubting system let a much smaller force punch way above its weight class.
But even with that incredible radar setup, the RAF was still hanging by a thread. Which brings us to Section 4, the lethal pivot. This is a sudden, massive shift in German strategy that quite literally altered the course of the entire war. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe inexplicably shifts their targeting. Instead of continuing to pound those vital RAF sector airfields into dust, which was working, remember, Hitler and Goering ordered the bombers to target London directly. Why? Well, it was actually largely an emotional response. A small, accidental German bombing of London led to a retaliatory RAF raid on Berlin, and Hitler was furious. It's wild when you step back and look at how pure ego and a desire for retaliation can cause such catastrophic, tactical military errors.
And that error was an absolute disaster for Germany. By shifting the bombing to London, the Luftwaffe instantly relieved the immense pressure on RAF 11 Group. It gave the British this absolutely crucial breathing room to go out, repair their cratered airfields, and get their aircraft and exhausted pilots replenished. And the consequence of that? On September 15th, which is now known as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched these massive daylight raids, fully expecting to meet a totally depleted enemy. Instead, they ran straight into fully assembled rested Spitfire and Hurricane wings. The heavy German bomber losses that day proved unequivocally that air superiority was just not going to happen.
And realizing that air superiority was impossible is super vital when we look at Section 5, the river barge flaw. This exposes what is easily the most logistically absurd component of Operation Sea Lion.
2,000. That is the actual number of slow, flat-bottomed converted river barges the Kriegsmarine planned to tow across the incredibly turbulent English Channel. Remember how we established the Kriegsmarine was pretty weak? They completely lacked true, purpose-built amphibious assault craft, so their big grand plan was to literally requisition these barges that were built for calm inland rivers. Trying to cross the choppy, unpredictable sea of the Channel while under heavy enemy fire in these things? It was an absolute disaster waiting to happen.
It creates this inescapable mathematical reality for failure. Look at it this way. Without total air superiority, you have an uncontested Royal Navy plus an intact RAF fighter command. That equals a total lack of air cover for the Germans. And the final result? The absolute annihilation of those slow, flat-bottomed barges. They would have been effortlessly slaughtered by Royal Navy destroyers before they even caught a glimpse of the white cliffs of Dover. The entire invasion was just a logistical fantasy as long as they didn't control the sky.
So, finally, let's turn to Section 6, the strategic aftermath. What did the ultimate failure of this massive air campaign actually mean for the rest of the world? Well, the consequences literally shaped the modern world. Recognizing that defeating the RAF was impossible, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion on September 17, 1940. This officially marked Nazi Germany's first major strategic defeat of the entire war. Since they couldn't close the Western Front, German forces were eventually redirected east for Operation Barbarossa, which was the disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union. But more importantly for the Allies, this failure preserved Great Britain. Britain got to remain this unsinkable aircraft carrier right off the coast of Europe, providing the absolutely vital launching pad for the 1944 D-Day invasion.
The incredible survival of Great Britain against what honestly seemed like completely insurmountable odds was perfectly summarized by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Speaking about those heavily outnumbered, completely exhausted RAF pilots, he famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." It really is a testament to how crucial the doubting system, incredible pilot bravery, and some very critical enemy missteps were to keeping the Allied cause alive.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought. What if Hitler and Goering hadn't let their egos dictate their strategy? What if that lethal pivot to London on September 7th had never happened and they had just kept relentlessly bombing those airfields for a few more weeks? It's highly likely the RAF fighter command would have totally collapsed, leaving the skies wide open for those 2,000 river barges, entirely rewriting the course of World War II. It really goes to show how the fate of millions can hinge on just one single, flawed decision. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the history you think you know.